Alrighty, welcome back to the finals of MXP Los Angeles. We've got Paul Green on Bant Nadu versus Robert Cedar on Jeskai Control. And I believe our match is ready. Our players are shuffling up. And
Yeah. This
we've
Nadu versus Jeskai matchup has been like kind of the story of the tournament. Last four matches we've casted this, and these are kind of the best prepared for this matchup version of both these decks. So interested to see how that plays out.
these are the strong players on strong versions of the deck. And I believe they're both keeping 7 with no, it looks like Robert Cedar is taking a mulligan. And Paul Green's hand looks quite solid. 2 lands, a Springheart Nantuko. I believe I saw a Malevolent Rumble in there. And it just has cards he can play and just develop material, which is important for these more assertive starts, especially without the main deck Sun Cleanser.
Yeah, pretty much what you want to be seeing in this matchup, where resiliency and the ability to go long matters a lot. So Malevolent Rumble at its best, very much where you want it most.
And our players are finishing shuffling. We're going to see what Robert's next hand looks like shortly.
Yeah, I think in the spot for Jeskai, ideal hand really is just like early interaction plus some card advantage. Notably, Wrath of this guy is still the best card, and even more so game one when there's not things like the One Ring that get around it. So I think really it makes sense from Robert's perspective to try and mulligan a little aggressively towards that, and definitely throw back 7s that are subpar and also don't have that card. And if you can find that card, it's nice. But if not, the deck's still pretty good at playing an interactive game.
Yeah, so this hand has 2 Flage, no Wrath of the Skies. Seems a bit suboptimal, but are you still just fine taking it on 6?
Yeah, I think on 6 your options get a lot more restricted than they do on 7. Once you get to 6 cards, you're kind of forced to keep like any even some semi-functional hand, because if you don't, then you just will lack raw cards to answer all the threats the Nadu deck has. Particularly with this version of the deck with Mumble and double woodlands, the deck is very good at presenting threats over and over again. And so if you go down to 5, just don't have enough cards to answer more than like 2 or 3 threats, you're just going to run out of answers, and your opponent is kind of going to steamroll you at some point or the other.
And Paul leads off with a wall of roots, just being able to commit to the board. It doesn't really die to any of the cheap removal that Robert Cedar has in the Jeskai control deck. So it's just going to be able to stick around, generate mana advantage, and be a body in play, which is so important for the Nadu deck. And Robert's going to have counterspell mana up.
Yeah, and this is kind of exactly the sort of hand you'd see Paul keep in this matchup, but maybe not matchups where you need to be faster. When no play on 1 and then just developing your mana onto a little on 2 is like a little awkward. But given how slow this matchup is, there's no pressure here to develop your mana quickly the way you would in some to develop your board quickly the way you would in some other matchups, and that means you do get to keep hands like this where you wouldn't otherwise.
Yeah, and Paul's just taking time thinking, making sure he knows what he wants to do into counterspell mana. And there's a Court of Calling, I believe a Springheart Nantuko. Not sure what else.
Yeah, so in a spot like this, the question is whether you want to uh, play a little safer against counter magic or 1-for-1 removal, right? But Springheart Nantuko Bestow is really, really good against 1-for-1 removal, and podcasting it is a little better against counter magic. You get to maybe threaten casting another card this turn, and is more likely to resolve if your opponent thinks that if your opponent does have 1/1 removal, right? They're much more likely to counter a bestowed Spring Heart and Tuco on a wall of roots if they don't have an easy way to answer that. Whereas for Paul, he's actually fine if the Spring Heart and Tuco gets 1/1 because he has the card in hand and can use that material to get another threat.
And now he's taking a moment to think while Robert surveils. And I can't quite see what card he banned. I think it was a One Ring, but I'm not fully sure.
Yeah, in this spot for Robert, it's pretty awkward figuring out how to interact with Paul's board. Plus, have interaction up for the combo pieces he could develop. Currently, Paul's board is not threatening the combo or anything of the sort, but is threatening a bunch of damage and more material over the next few turns. So it's not something Robert can just leave unchecked forever. But at the same time, if he goes to aggressively interact with Paul's board and doesn't leave counter magic up, dying to the combo is quite likely. So pretty tough spot.
And on the end step, Paul fetches for a Surveil land, and with the Surveil tree on the stack, gets to cord for, I'm not sure exactly how much. It's 1, 2, 3. I believe it is cord for 3. And it gets invert polarityed. Is this cord going to find a Flage? And I believe it is not.
Yeah, I think makes sense to leave up invert polarity there, given we know that there's very likely to be a card in hand with the way mana was left up. So yeah, I think it's a high risk, high reward line where this whole turn being spent on counter magic is really, really bad and may even end up losing the game for Robert. But I think you have to take that risk, try and find a Flage, because there's no way of really answering two things well here. And so leaving up invert polarity to counter God of Call and kind of the one way he comes back into this game from being so far behind.
And Paul Green has the Nadu, has the cord for Outrider. Does Robert have the Force of Negation? He does not. And Paul Green needs to whiff on a land in 12 lux. And it's technically possible.
It's technically possible, but I'd say the chances are pretty close to 0. Particularly given this is an instant speed combo. He could go for it again on Robert's upkeep. I don't really see this panning out for Robert. This game seems pretty over. Well,
yeah,
this game seems very over.
Yeah, it's almost impossible. It's absolutely just not going to whiff from here. Especially with the second Nadu in hand, meaning that just another land is just reset. And game 1's going to go to Paul Green.
Yeah, looking at Paul's list, his angles of comboing are a little less guaranteed to end the game than other versions. He has the Beseiju. I don't see an Otawara. Yeah, I'm wondering whether there's any version of this where he combos and doesn't win the game. But I think the chances of that are pretty low because he can gain infinite life with Dryad Arbor, and then with Haywire Might, and then stack his deck if he wants to.
Yeah, there are 3 basics in Robert Cedar's deck, so it's not. Robert will be able to have lands and would be able to threaten to Wrath of the Skies for 2. But if Paul makes infinite copies of Outriders Encore or Endurance, then I don't believe. Well, there's Verdict.
I think Robert can Wrath of the Skies for 3 because there was a Tune the Narrative cost earlier this game.
Yep, there is 2 energy floating
already. So
yeah, so he could or Verdict.
Yeah, so he could wipe the board after Paul goes off. I'm trying to figure out whether Paul's deck has any lines to actually win the game in a way that can beat Wrath of the Skies. Like we said, there's definitely the ability to gain infinite life. I think there was also the ability to stack his deck in a way that will let him win next turn.
Yeah, you can kind of just do whatever when you have all of the pieces of when you have all of the pieces of this deck available to you. It's just Paul playing a single Beseiju in that slot, and Robert scoops it up.
Yeah, it's quite likely there is some weird loop we missed that lets Robert functionally win the game. So yeah, what you get to do is you gain infinite life with all your with Haywire Might if you want to. You get to get rid of every non-basic land in play for Robert, though there are 3 basics that can be put into play off Viseju and can't be destroyed.
Can
But yeah, I think it's basically impossible for Robert to win from that spot, even if it is possible for him to untap and take another turn.
Jeskai actually beat infinite life?
I think the way Jeskai beats infinite life is by decking their opponent.
Yeah, but if you
So,
sacrifice
not
all your
really.
lands and then endurance yourself, you can just say infinite life and force your opponent to deck themselves.
Yes, I believe it is not actually possible for Robert to win in that spot, but I'm very glad we didn't have to watch that happen. Yeah. The line Paulgren could have taken is end of turn, discard everything to hand size, and then cast endurance, sacrifice all your lands, put them all back in deck. And at that point, that is more cards in his deck than Roberts, and that should have won the game. So that is, I suppose, the deterministic win in that spot.
And our players are sideboarding, and is there anything unique in these sideboards? Previously, I believe we saw Robert brought in Consigned to Memory against Nadu as an answer to One Ring. How do you feel about that?
That makes sense because Nadu is pretty tough for Robert to answer the ring out of, given the way his deck is structured post board. There's just not that many ways to actually kill it. So one of the main ways you lose fair games post board is against the ring. It's a little clunky for an answer. It does still have other uses too. It can hit Shuko, which is nice. So that means it's not completely dead if your opponent doesn't have the ring, and it can technically hit as a Saga triggered abilities. Those are generally not the strongest thing to hit, but is yet another way it can deny Paul a combo piece. So it makes sense to be bringing in.
Yeah, it's it's a really neat choice, and I hope we can see it come to some use. It can also just scam Flagen, which would be funny to watch.
Yeah, the scabbing Flage is a fun little part of the utility of stuff like Dress Down and Consigned to Memory in a deck like this, where you make sure Flage doesn't hit your graveyard with its initial trigger. This is not the matchup where that's the most relevant, because frequently tapping out for a large threat is not what you want to do against Nadu, but it still comes up.
And I believe we've started our game. Paul Green has started with a Gemstone Caverns in play.
Yeah,
Which is
this is
always fun
something
to
we've
watch.
seen more and more, is that these decks with either these Haymaker powerful card advantage engines or some critical number that they really want to get to, will play a copy of Gemstone Caverns in the sideboard, just to make sure that, just because being on the play on the draw, when you being sort of on the play when you're technically on the draw, is really, really powerful, and just a good thing for these decks to have access to, while not being good enough as a land to be worth playing in the main deck. So it's an interesting way the texture of Modern has changed, and makes for some fun games post-mod where things play out a little differently on the play than you'd expect them to because your opponent had a Gemstone Caverns on one.
And Paul has a One Ring in his hand. So being able to get a turn 2 One Ring seems very good against Jeskai when their only way to answer when they're going to have a counterspell or pitch cast a force.
Yeah, when you put it that way, that makes Gemstone Caverns sound absolutely messed up, with accelerating the One Ring being a really, really powerful thing to do.
And Robert has his own ring, a Subtlety, a Wrath of Disguise, and a couple additional lands. So he's surveilling here, hoping to find something that lets him keep up with Paul Green's explosive start.
Well, the thing is, given that hand, there's nothing he can draw here, right? Because he needs a blue sauce and counter magic to be able to answer the ring. There could be a consign, I suppose.
Or Force of Negation, exactly.
But yeah, not very many good answers to the ring available.
And looks at the top card, thinking about it. And it's a tap land, so Paul Green's just going to be able to play out his One Ring and have it resolve.
Yeah, and knowing that none of the answers Robert could have in his deck are represented here is pretty big. There's literally only consigned counterspells, not something he has mana for, or could have had mana for, and this means Paul is pretty safe to go for it. It's hard to imagine not jamming the ring here, and yeah, it's going to be really hard for Robert to come back from that. We've been over it, but he doesn't really have very many ways to deal with a resolved ring.
And we've seen Jeskai take over games just from having a resolved ring in play. This is even better than that, since Paul's the one asking the questions.
Yeah, at least with Jeskai, there's an element of push and pull to the ring, where your opponent applying pressure makes the life loss pretty important. But Robert's not applying any pressure here, so Paul can just draw infinite cards, and it's hard to imagine Robert coming back from this. Turn 2 One Ring can just be so brutal.
And Robert just passes his turn doing nothing, letting Paul have the room he wants to just maneuver. That's a Sun Cleanser, just pre-prepared, answering the Wrath of the Skies before it even is a thought about casting it.
Yeah, and at this point for Paul, it's not really about what the threats he runs out are, just so much that he runs out some amount of threats. Yeah, he just wants to force Robin into one for wanting him a bunch and then win with the One Ring.
And Paul doesn't actually have that much in hand right now. I believe it's just Nadu and a bunch of lands. But Robert's playing his own ring. It's the only way he can fight on that level. But if Paul gets a way to combo with Nadu, that could just be the event right here.
Yeah, I do want to note that we know Robert has subtlety. So he is going to be able to interact with Nadu and not just die while he stepped out. But the ring being 2 turns ahead for Paul, plus Paul's deck being the assertive one, means that in this head-to-head, you gotta feel like the Nadu deck is favored.
And he's just drawing 3 cards. That's Skyclave Apparition is an answer to the One Ring. There's 2 chords, there's Nadu. There's so much. Paul has so many choices he can make.
I have to imagine whichever of Apparition and Nadu gets Ghost here gets Subtletied. That's really not the end of the world, given it's coming back next turn. And again, that's 2 more cards Robert is spending, so kind of going further behind on cards against this One Ring. We are starting to get to the point where they're wondering where the number of cards really don't matter. You've drawn all the cards you could ever use, and it would be interesting whether we maybe even see Paul risk suddenly losing to the One Ring with something like a bunch of Flages out of Robert representing quick damage against a low life total Paul. But yeah, barring something like that happening, I really, really like Paul's chances. I also want to point out that at this point, we know that in his sideboard, Paul has a copy of Vexing Bauble. There's an Urza Saga on 2, so that Vexing Bauble is quite likely to enter play next turn. And then suddenly, the only thing Robert has going for him right now is the fact that they both have One Rings in play, but he can cast a bunch of free spells to leverage the cards better. Once that's gone, once there's no free spells available to Robert, it seems completely impossible for him to keep up with Paul Green in terms of Paul Green's threats being a lot cheaper than his answers.
Yeah, and one issue that Paul's had this turn is that all of the cards in his hand are 3 mana, so he only played one thing out. And Rob being able to trade raw cards for it means he at least has a chance.
Pile of Wrath of the Sky is not very good into Sun Cleanser.
I mean, it still answers the Urza Saga, if that's something that has to be done.
Yeah, X's 0 on Wrath of the Sky is answering the Urza Saga might just be something we see happen, given Robert needs to not fall too far behind, maybe at least stymie Paul's mana a little bit. But yeah, we know there's a Skyclave Apparition on top. We know there's nothing in Robert's hand that prevents that from resolving, because the removal spells in hand are Wrath of the Skies and Galvanic Discharge, and that means next turn the One Ring gets dealt with, and it's hard to imagine Robert coming back from that.
And this Urza Saga is almost certainly going to be getting the Vexing Bauble, like you mentioned, with no blue mana up. It's just so much safer for Paul to do that.
Yeah, the only other thing I could see this Saga possibly getting is a Shuko, if Paul just wants to go for it.
Yeah, like
given there's no blue mana up, there'd have to be yet another subtlety. But if there is a subtlety, then the Skyclave Apparition could just take care of the One Ring. So we know that it's extremely unlikely that there'll be 2 more subtleties, both pitch casts in this fight. So even if Paul doesn't want to get the Saga, he's pretty safe and can likely win here, one way or another.
and Paul is taking his time thinking about what to do, and really just deciding what he's going to do before he gets the card with the Saga. And he's activating the One Ring in response, just so he has more information. Is that Spell Pierce?
A little extra information never hurt. Yeah, Spell Pierce can really make sure, I think, that the combo is safe to go for here. The combo is, I suppose, not deterministic with no Spring Heart and Tuco in play, but that's fine. I have to imagine getting a pile of cards here also wins Paul the game. Notably, in Roberts, we saw earlier lists of Jeskai having things like a Rending Volley in the sideboard. I don't believe there are no copies of that in Robert's sideboard. So I think this actually just 0 instant speed answers to a resolved Nadu and Oshuko.
That is correct. And if there aren't any answers, Paul might just go for it.
Yeah, I think in this spot, Paul probably supposed to just slam Nadu, and yeah, very likely win the game.
And we'll see if Nadu resolves. And it does.
Yeah, we'll see the handy dandy Nadu 8 to show how much each type of creature, show how many times each creature has been targeted each turn. Yep, there's a Spring Heart Nantuko, so that should make things extra safe.
Yeah, and hits the breeding pool, and we'll see what it takes for Robert to pick up his cards.
Yeah, I think we're still in the spot where it seems like not impossible for Paul to fizzle, though extremely unlikely. Once we see like a second Nadu or something of the sort, then
There is a
it
second
gets to a
Nadu in
point where
hand.
it's deterministic. We know there's a second Nadu, but
It was
yeah, I imagine that's the thing
it's face up.
holding Robert off of conceding. Oh, right, it's been revealed as well.
Yeah. So is that a
Second,
chord for second Nantuko? And
yeah, second Spring Hot Nantuko makes fizzling really, really difficult here.
yeah, and Paul's just going through the motions, playing out his cards. He's at this point he can't fizzle, and he's just gonna win this match.
Yeah, so what he's gonna do is he's gonna get to the point where he does all the stuff we talked about, where he gets his entire deck empty with the endurances, and yeah, demonstrate a loop, and at that point he can just do it as many times as he wants. So yeah, taking
And
this one down.
Paul Green is the winner of MXP Los Angeles. Congratulations to him. That was some really well played Nadu. He did a really good job of just knowing exactly how much flexibility he had to have and just being very precise with his lines.
Yeah, extremely well played, piloted to perfection, really, recognizing when to go for it, when to play it safe, and yeah, rewarded for that play. I mean, dominant performance by this version of Nadu, of course, showing that the deck really has a lot of resiliency even to these control decks, but also by Paul, showing how the mashup might seem hard at first glance against control, particularly for like the more conventional, faster versions of Nadu. But yeah, this list does really well against it, particularly when piloted well. You could sort of leverage Nadu very well to have a good long game in a matchup like this. So well played by Paul.
Yeah, it was just phenomenal magic. And yeah.
Yeah, all around, a lot of good magic, a lot of play to the games, despite being like some of the same matchups. Like we saw Jeskai against Nadu a bunch of different times, and the matches. A lot of times we see the same matchup over and over again. Kind of gets boring and repetitive, but every game played really differently. There's a lot of different things that matter in these matchups, and there's a lot of texture to these matchups that make for some really good plays. So really enjoyed watching a lot of good magic this weekend.
Yeah, it felt like every player played it meaningfully differently and it was a different matchup every time. And
Very much so.
I believe that's all. Thank you everyone for watching. And I just want to say it is the person doing production, Amber. It's her birthday today. Can everyone in chat say happy birthday, Amber? And with that, congratulations once again to Paul for winning MXP Los Angeles. And have a good night, everyone.
Yeah. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks, Amber, for putting on this great show. And thanks for casting with me, Nor.
Yeah, thanks for casting with me.